The Villa Tavern was located on the western side of Villa Street, roughly halfway between Nursery Road and Wills Street. Whilst parish boundaries are clearly defined, different areas within Aston and Birmingham are a little more complex. Some references to the Villa Tavern suggest it was in Hockley, but I tend to steer towards Lozells, as the building was towards the northern end of the thoroughfare. Certainly the Villa Tavern was included in Aston during early census surveys, as it was north of the Hockley Brook. Technically, therefore, it was not a Birmingham pub until midway through its lifespan. The immediate surroundings of the Villa Tavern were largely residential in the early to mid-19th century. However, a large watch manufactory rose up around 1870. Construction of the manufactory was supervised by Aaron Lufkin Dennison, an entrepreneur who had attempted to crack the American market. The plant and machinery installed inside the works was transported from Massachusetts when he found investors in Birmingham following the failure of the Melrose Watch Company. Formed in 1871, the new enterprise was named the Anglo-American Watch Company Limited. Aaron Dennison was initially in charge of the Villa Street works, but perhaps because of the failure to successfully export to the United States, the result of an economic slump in America, coupled with excessive import duties, the venture floundered. Perhaps in a bid to focus on different markets, the trading name was changed to the English Watch Company, but the business went into liquidation in 1875. The premises, machinery and stock in trade were subsequently acquired from the liquidators by William Bragg for the sum of £5,500. It is worth mentioning that due to the contribution Aaron Dennison made to machine-made watches, his grandson, Major Gilbert Dennison, when serving as chairman of the local advisory committee for post office services, was chosen to officiate at the inaugural ceremony for the speaking clock in Birmingham in November 1938. His duties included dialing TIM to hear the golden voice of Jane Kane, the woman who had won a competition to be the voice of the speaking clock. Although born in Birmingham, William Bragg, an engineer and antiquary, had prospered in Sheffield, where he was elected mayor. He enjoyed a remarkable career during which he had carried out the lighting of the city of Rio de Janeiro with gas, and followed this by surveying the first railway constructed in Brazil, for which he received several distinctions from the Emperor Dom Pedro. Day-to-day management of the Villa Street manufactory was handled by his brother Robert Bragg. He had been a watchmaker from his early days and had years of experience of the trade. Why am I banging on about the adjacent factory, I hear you ask? Well, when writing about the history of a tavern, I like to place it within its contextual setting, combined with a little social history. After all, pubs did not operate in isolation and formed a symbiotic relationship within their locale. I should stress that the manufactory had accommodation for 300 employees. In addition to local residents, this provided the Villa Tavern with a very strong customer base. Back in the day, it was deemed acceptable to have a pint or two during the lunch hour, even if the individual was operating dangerous machinery. Publicans would also line up the counter with full glasses of ale in time for the sound of the hooter at the end of the day's shift. The first beer was generally consumed by thirsty workers in double quick time. Before discussing the Villa Tavern in some detail, it is worth reading of a vivid description of the works by a reporter for the Birmingham Mail who visited the works in 1877. The journalist wrote that the chance passer-by would never imagine that a manufacture of any magnitude could be carried on here. A little front office with an unpretentious brass plate on the door is all that indicated to the stranger that there is in existence the English Watchmaking Company. But pass through the office and enter the courtyard and you will be surprised to see an immense factory rearing its head. The building consists of 3 main shops and a cluster of smaller ones in which processes of a character subsidiary to the general manufacturer are carried on. Altogether there are 16 separate shops, and as there are many processes to go through before a watch is made by machinery, the arrangement for the location of the workpeople is according to a well-matured system. The greatest care and anxiety is manifested for the health and convenience of the workpeople. The rooms are all lofty and well ventilated and are kept very clean. By means of steam pipes they are warmed throughout to a suitable temperature, and there is an entire absence of dust, which in many factories exercises an injurious influence on the health of the workpeople. The story of the Villa Tavern is older than the watch manufactory. The building was traded a couple of decades before Aaron Dennison executed the plans for his new factory. The Villa Tavern opened in the 1840s. John Robbins is the earliest reference I have seen for the premises. I think he may have been a key figure within the local Jewish community. Certainly he was running the fully licensed pub with his wife Eliza by 1849. The couple came and went several times during the mid-19th century, perhaps suggesting that they had signed a lease for the pub and either sublet the property to other people or installed managers to run the place for them. John Robbins was a button stamper and maker by trade, and seemed to concentrate on this career path rather than serving beer. It is possible that he sublet the house, but a couple of the tenant publicans failed in the business, forcing John Robbins to take over the licence until he found another couple to run the pub. He was generally close at hand because his workshop was close to the Villa Tavern. Christopher Cook is one publican that spent a short period in Villa Street. He was running the Villa Tavern by the end of 1851 and started up a £50 society on January the 12th, 1852. This type of savings scheme sprang up in the Victorian period and were operated from many public houses. John Robbins took over the licence again before Joseph Lingard became the publican in the mid-1850s. He divided his time between the pub and working as a brass tube maker. His wife Sarah no doubt kept the Villa Tavern going when he was earning another income grafting in a factory. The couple would later run the Wellington Inn on Bridge Street West. John Pickering became the licensee in the mid-1860s. It was not a successful time for the publican. He lasted until the spring of 1868, when the licence was transferred back to John Robbins. John Pickering was declared bankrupt in June 1869, following which he and his wife Ellen moved to lodgings at Sutton Place in Lennox Street. He had tried to pick up the pieces by working as a clerk and warehouseman. He lost his wife, but recovered his career and subsequently kept a linen drapery on Aston's High Street. Ownership of the Villa Tavern changed towards the end of 1871. John Robbins, button maker and several times licensee of the public house, retired to Poplar Place in George Street. An advertisement appeared in the press during November 1871 describing the premises that included a comfortable smokeroom, bar, taproom, suitable chambers, stabling and brewery. This is the first reference I have seen that there was once a brewery to the rear of the Villa Tavern. So it would appear that, like the neighbouring Vine Inn, the Villa Tavern was once a homebrew house. William Thrustance was recorded at the Villa Tavern in 1871. He and his wife Emily moved from the Latimer's Arms in Latimer Street, so jumped from beerhouse statements to that of a fully licensed house. An extension of Upper Gough Street and close to St Thomas's Church, Latimer Street was later called Ridley Street. It is not to be confused with the Latimer Street at Leebank, which was formerly known as Latimer Street South. Prior to the Latimer's Arms, William and Emily Thrustance had kept the Anchor Inn on Islington Row. Their stay at the Villa Tavern was, however, brief, and by 1873 they had moved to the Dolphin Inn on Irving Street. They seemed to enjoy that pub more and remained there for some years. The couple did well for themselves and eventually retired with some wealth to Ferndale Cottage in Shirley. It would seem that the Villa Tavern was still producing home-brewed ales in the 1870s because publican George Healy's son, William, was recorded as a brewer. The Healy family had previously kept the Navigation Inn at Oxford Street. Born in the town around 1820, George Healy married Anne Lydia Poulton in August 1845 at the Church of St. Peter in Harborne. Their early matrimonial home was on Little Hampton Street, from where George Healy worked as a button maker. He surrendered the licence of the Navigation Inn in May 1872, by which time he was probably running the Villa Tavern under a protection order. By this time, the watch manufactory had been established. Living immediately next to the Villa Tavern was the jeweller Robert Ward. He had been here since the very early days of Villa Street being laid out. He had named his property Alpine Cottage, but his relative peace and possibly some daylight had no doubt been ruined by the construction of the new factory. George Henry Edwards was mine host of the Villa Tavern by February 1887. He held regular meetings of the Birthnight Society, a term that has two meanings. The first is that patrons of the pub would gather and make merry at the expense of the members whose birthday happens to have fallen during the preceding week. They were regarded as very harmonious and convivial evenings. However, I have seen a reference to the same term meaning that a birthnight society is avowedly established upon political grounds and intended for the express purposes of keeping under a regular union amongst the Conservative Party. Judging by the newspaper notice in which George Edwards stated that all friends are cordially invited, it would appear that it was an evening of singing rather than one of political discourse. George Edwards also attempted to launch a dramatic club at the Villa Tavern, and in January 1890 advertised for new members to come with a view to stage. An account of another social event held at the Villa Tavern later in the year revealed that George Edwards had previously kept the White Horse on Victoria Road. On Thursday the 15th of December 1887, he hosted the annual dinner at the Villa Tavern Birthnight Society. The spread, it was reported, was of a splendid character both for quality and quantity, and was served up in Mr. Edwards' well-known style. Upwards of 60 gentlemen attended the evening and partook in the dinner, before a convivial evening of songs and readings. The annual dinner was held in a new room built by George Edwards, the landlord using the event as the opening night of this addition to the premises. It was described as ample in size, substantially built, and beautifully decorated. The new function room was the reason that George Edwards was made to appear before the Aston Police Court during the following April. The publican was summoned for erecting a building without giving notice to the surveyor of the local board, a body represented in court by Mr. Ansell. The complaint against George Edwards was that he had erected a new building to the rear of the Villa Tavern without being granted permission. From the case notes, it was reported that the rear of the Villa Tavern was an open space or yard which the publican had covered with a roof of corrugated iron, converting the place into a concert room with a boarded floor and a stage at one end. It was stated that in order to make the roof perfect, George Edwards had raised one of the three walls which formed the sides of the building. The case hinged on the fact that the local board had failed to prosecute within a designated 6-month period from when building work had commenced. Mind you, it was a close shave. In the end, the bench dismissed these summons and the building was allowed to remain. In celebratory defiance, George Edwards splashed out on adverts in the local newspapers that he had a large function room available for functions, social events, and complete with in-house catering. During this period, there was one night in the calendar year in which sales inside the Villa Tavern would have been quiet. The reason for the slump in takings was due to the employees of the watch manufactory embarking on their annual way-goose laid on by the management of the English Watch Company. For example, in September 1888, a party of some 90 male employees piled into 3 large brakes and headed to the Prince of Wales Inn at Hagley. The brakes were supplied by the Birmingham Tramway Company and superintended by Mr. Jeans of the Finch Road stables. The journey was described as pleasant, though everyone had to clamber out of the carriage when they arrived at the top of Mucklow Hill at Halesowen. The men then had to force march down the hill, as it was deemed too dangerous for such a heavy load to career down the long, steep incline. Arriving at mid-morning, the interval until lunch was occupied with a cricket match, games of bowls, quoits and football. Host Everton was praised for the dinner served up in excellent style. The nosh was worked off by a little ramble around the neighbouring hills before returning home in the evening. Disappointingly, there was not much detail reported on the trip enjoyed by the women who worked at the watch factory. Together with a few friends, they had visited Upper Arley on the River Severn. We are close to getting to that period when the larger brewery concerns of Birmingham started to buy up public houses in order to develop tied estates in which to retail larger volumes of their products. I do not know the date of purchase, but the Villa Tavern was definitely snapped up by Holders Brewery Limited. The Villa Tavern's ownership is recorded in the licence register compiled by the Magistrate's Office, and this shows a rather unusual pattern for this public house. Generally, a pub is usually purchased by a common brewery in the late 19th century, and then ownership changes as the brewery is acquired by a larger rival. So, for example, a Holders house would typically remain with the Aston-based brewery until they were taken over by Mitchells and Butlers in 1919, and this can be seen in the licence register. The pub would then usually remain with the Capel Brewery until the licence was extinguished, or until the merger of Mitchells and Butlers with Bass, Radcliffe and Gretton Limited of Burton-on-Trent in 1961. However, this was not the case at the Villa Tavern, as the public house was taken over by Joseph Charles Eggington. He was involved with a number of pubs in the Coventry area, but during the First World War was residing at the Royal Oak at Dudley Port, a pub that was once a Holders house until they were taken over by Mitchells and Butlers. I suspect that some form of wheeler dealing or property exchange took place, but in the absence of any documents, this is conjecture on my part. The Villa Tavern was eventually taken over by Atkinson's Brewery Limited of Aston. The Villa Tavern can be seen in the company's livery in photographs on the website. The pub would sell their beers until 1959, when the company was taken over by Mitchells and Butlers. The gracefully named Henry Heaven was the licensee of the Villa Tavern in the early 1890s. Like many of the previous incumbents, he had to earn an income in a local factory whilst his wife kept the pub open during the day. The machinist had married Amy Heath in 1885, and by the time the couple were running the pub, they had two sons, Harold and Charles. The boys were both born in Smethwick, so it would seem that Henry Heaven had moved over the county border in order to find work. This was a blueprint for the family, as his father, a blacksmith by trade, had uprooted from Mangotsfield in Gloucestershire, the birthplace of Henry Heaven, in order to ply his skills in Birmingham. Henry and Amy Heaven committed to the licensed trade, though once again the allure of the Villa Tavern did not induce the couple to stay for any length of time. The couple would later run the White Swan on Victoria Road, at a time when the pub was operated by Rushton's Brewery Limited. After working for two of Birmingham's large breweries, Henry and Amy Heaven managed to gather the finance to buy their own pub. In a rate book compiled in 1906, Henry Heaven was recorded as owner and publican of the Swan with Two Necks in Lawley Street. Meanwhile, at the adjacent watch factory, there was something of a roller coaster in fortunes. The English Watch Company had developed a domestic market, along with some success exporting to countries within the empire. At a dinner held at the Great Western Hotel in December 1891, it was stated that the business had used 17,000 ounces of silver during the year in the making of watch cases. However, the company was still reliant on some Swiss components, a dependency that was problematic and betrayed the public's perception of the company name. This landed them in trouble with the London Watchmakers' Protection Society. Despite an increase in production, some of which was achieved in upgrading the plant and machinery, the company was unable to pay a dividend for 3 years in succession in the late 1880s, forcing the resignation of the manager, Charles Hazler. The company stumbled on until February 1895, when during an extraordinary general meeting held at the Grand Hotel on Colmore Row, a resolution was passed that the company should be wound up voluntarily. By the end of the 19th century, the factory next to the Villa Tavern was occupied by the Claremont Cycle Manufacturing Company Limited, a firm that had previously built cycles in Bishop Street. It was in 1892 that the cycle manufacturer William Russon went into partnership with W.C. Lloyd, the financial backer of the enterprise. Together they established a cycle factory in Sherborne Road at Balsall Heath. Rapid growth resulted in them moving to new premises in Bishop Street. In 1896, the Claremont Cycle Company Limited was rolling out 150 bicycles per week. The move to Villa Street seems to have been the result of a financial dispute between the partners. William Russon had established the Colossal Cycle Company, again with W.C. Lloyd, but this was broken up, and Russon continued independently in Lancaster Street before opening a string of shops trading as the Main Wheeleries. He was declared bankrupt in 1904. The Villa Street factory of the Claremont Cycle Manufacturing Company was wound up early in the Edwardian period. In the last years of the 19th century, Henry James Melhuish was the publican at the Villa Tavern. He kept the Holder's house with his wife Mary Ann. This couple certainly introduced a different accent to the place, as Henry was born in 1857 at Bridgewater in Somerset, whilst Mary Ann hailed from Rimney in Monmouthshire. The couple had previously kept the Plume of Feathers in Mile Street in the Springvale area of Bawdsley. The Villa Tavern appears to have been unoccupied at the time of the 1901 census. Perhaps Holder's Brewery Limited were upgrading the property. Certainly, Henry and Mary Ann Melhuish emerged shortly afterwards at the Compasses on High Street, Derrit End, a tavern also operated by Holders. Perhaps the brewery relocated the couple whilst work was being conducted at the Villa Tavern. It is satisfying sometimes that during the research of publicans one can find part of the story behind the people's movements. Looking back on Henry Melhuish, it can be seen that he was born at Bridgewater, but his father's work on the railways took him to Monmouthshire, which was almost certainly explains how he met his wife. However, when looking at the family household in a cottage at Llanfrecna during the early 1870s, one finds that his younger brother Seymour. He would later work as a plumber in Taunton, where his father had once again moved for the railway company. Meanwhile, Henry made his way to Worcester with his young wife before they settled in Birmingham. At around the same time that Henry and Mary Ann Melhuish were moving their things from the Villa Tavern to the Compasses, younger brother Seymour, along with his wife Leonora Coombs, moved to Kingswinford to briefly manage the Leopard in Summer Street. Perhaps his elder brother suggested life was good at Birmingham, because soon after Seymour and Leonora took over at the helm of the Barton's Arms in High Street, Aston. Mary Ann Melhuish died in 1906. 2 years later, Henry married again, the ceremony with Elizabeth Dawes taking place in August 1908 at St Martin's Church. The couple may have installed a living manager or servant because they were in residence at number 39 Golden Hillock Road. However, around the end of the Edwardian period, they moved out to Ward End to run the old barley mow. The couple only stayed at Ward End for a few years before they moved again, running the Hare and Hounds on Marsh Hill at Erdington. Henry and Elizabeth clearly liked their new location, and they remained there until the 1930s. Elizabeth died in March 1932, by which time Henry had given up the pub game. However, together with his daughter Marian, he was recorded as a wines and spirits merchant at Gravelly Lane. He died at Weston Road in March 1944 and left a little nest egg to Marian, who had married Thomas Wright Wilkinson. Edward and Agnes Glover were running the Villa Tavern at the start of King George V's reign. The son of a baker, Edward Glover was born in Leominster in Herefordshire. As a young man he lived at the Stour Valley Inn on the corner of Monument Road and Great Tyndall Street, where he worked as a barman for Caroline Morton. In February 1892 he married Agnes Suckling at St Mark's Church. The couple may have spent some time at Wolverhampton because their daughter Hetty was born there in 1894. However, by 1901 they were back in Hockley and running the Great Western Inn on Icknield Street. Frank Stokes had become a celebrity publican of the Villa Tavern by 1913. He had recently hung up his footballing boots after a distinguished playing career. As a left full-back, he started his career with Port Vale, his local team. He moved to Reading for 2 seasons before joining Birmingham, when they were still known as the Small Heath Alliance. He made his first team debut at Mont Street on October the 12th, 1903, in a charity cup match. His first league match was versus Blackburn Rovers a week later on October the 17th. During his 10 years with Birmingham, he was reserved to the England fullback and Blackburn Rovers legend Bob Crompton. For his service to the club, the proceeds of a game against Manchester City in October 1909 was a benefit to Frank Stokes. He signed for Worcester City at the start of the next season, but this was at the twilight of his playing days. A serious knee injury put paid to his career by the time he was 30 years old. When he stopped playing, he became a publican, but seemed to move around a fair bit before settling down. At the time of the 1911 census, he and his wife May were running the Bath Tavern in Brougham Street. Frank Stokes was born in Burslem in the Potteries, whilst May hailed from Derby. They had a son named Frank who was born just a few weeks before the census was undertaken. He would train to be a dentist in later life. The couple would later have 2 daughters, Marion and Eileen. After a spell at the Villa Tavern, Frank and May Stokes moved to the Crown and Anchor on Watery Lane. They had moved by the outbreak of World War I. Indeed, not long after they had moved to Bawdsley, Frank Stokes got into a lot of trouble when he accused Jacob Friedman of being a German. In fact, Jacob Friedman, a resident of Speedwell Road, who had a jeweller's shop in New Street, was Russian by birth, but was a naturalised citizen. However, such allegations caused a lot of issues for the accused, as the public generally reacted in a very poor manner. In some cases, traders would be driven out of business. Jacob Friedman sought legal advice to defend his reputation, and Frank Stokes was forced to publicly apologise for his actions in November 1914. Following the First World War, Frank and May Stokes moved to the Swan Hotel at Coleshill for several years. However, they returned to Birmingham to run the Roebuck on Broad Street for a good number of years. It is hard to keep up with the constant movements of the Stokes family. However, another pub I have found them running in the late 1930s was the Great Western Hotel at Acock's Green. It was reported that at the beginning of the Second World War, Frank Stokes retired to Broadway, but when hostilities ceased, he took over the Coventry Cross at Kenilworth. Frank and May Stokes finally hung up their bartels around 1952 and moved to Hillview at Baddesley Clinton near Chadwick End. Frank Stokes died there in 1957 at the age of 76. Albert Hill was the publican of the Villa Tavern throughout the First World War, following which Albert Price took over behind the servery. I have a few details about this man. It is an unusual story, and I wish I knew more because there's seemingly a lot between the lines. The son of a carter, Albert Price was baptised in June 1881 at Ladywood, though his parents were living in Rocky Lane at Neashalls. By the start of the Edwardian period, the Price family had moved to Byron Road in Small Heath, where Albert, at the relatively young age of 21, was documented as a manager in the timber trade. Albert Price married Maria Stevens in April 1905, and the couple established a home in Byron Road. During the First World War, Albert and Maria Price moved to Hockley, where they rather curiously took over a grocery shop and off-licence. After more than 5 years selling beer for consumption off the premises, they moved to the Villa Tavern where they could socialise with their patrons. The couple's stay was however brief, with Albert going back to work with wood. Indeed, in 1925 he established his own timber business in Bennett's Hill. Commuting from his home at number 68 Dorder Road, Albert Price was industrious, and working with his son Cyril, the enterprise was successful. Maria Price became very ill in the 1930s and was confined to bed for several months. She was just getting out and about when tragedy struck in 1933, and she died after being involved in an accident in the car driven by her husband. Albert Price told the subsequent inquest that his wife had been very ill for years. He was driving the car when it skidded into a stump on the Digbeth side of Park Street. He told the coroner that he had a Mr. Warren sitting in the front seat with him, and in the back of the car were his wife, Mrs. Warren, and his daughter. The former publican stated that the near-side rear brake drum of his car had 3 times been reached by oil, which caused the wheel to lock at the slightest application of the brake. Since the accident, he added, it had been found that apparently the wheel had locked in this way. He went on to say that at the time of the accident he applied his brake when he was travelling at about 25 miles an hour. The car started to skid and turn broadside. The offside of the back of the car, where his wife was sitting, struck the post. The other 2 passengers in the back were thrown against his wife. If the tram lines had not been there, continued Albert Price, I should have got out of the skid. The jury expressed an opinion that Albert Price used due care and that the cause of the accident was a faulty rear brake. In the same year, that was 1933, Albert Price moved the timber business to Washwood Heath Road at Ward End. The widower bought a house a little further towards Castle Bromwich and employed a housekeeper and domestic to do the chores. His son Cyril moved into 53 Douglas Avenue with his wife Marjorie. The will of Albert Price makes for interesting reading. The success of the business can be gauged by the fact that he left an estate of over £100,000. However, many eyebrows were possibly raised when the newspapers reported that his secretary was the main beneficiary. She had worked for Albert Price when she left the Aston Commercial School until his death on May the 19th, 1960. Under the will, Miss Beatrice Rooker of Stanlake Avenue in Ward End was to receive £15,500 on trust for life and a cash sum estimated at £12,000. Albert's son Cyril was simply left with his father's bureau bookcase. His father had stated that he had made no bequest to him as he was otherwise well provided for. During its history, nobody really stuck at it at the Villa Tavern. Publicans came and went. It's never a great sign for a boozer. Mind you, if the locals did not particularly like the gaffer, at least it wasn't long before another incumbent arrived. This was the case in the 1920s when at least 8 different people held the licence of the pub. After a brief spell under the ownership of the aforementioned Joseph Eggington and his wife Annie, Henry Lapidus took over the reins. I imagine that in later years he made strenuous efforts to hide the fact that his middle name was Adolf. Henry Lapidus was certainly no stranger to pubs. His father Samuel, a former chandelier maker from Ledbury in Herefordshire, kept a couple of Birmingham boozers with his Worcester-born wife Elizabeth. In 1891 the couple were running the Compasses Inn on Great Francis Street. Henry lived there with his parents whilst working as a brass founder. Henry Lapidus was still living with his father, a widower, when he was made manager of the Crown on Church Road in Aston. Henry had evidently become a skilled worker and was recorded as an art metal worker in the 1911 census. This was a life-changing year for Henry Lapidus. He got married and later made a career change. His friends may have joked that he was having a midlife crisis. He married Annie Garrity of Saltley in July 1911 and lived for a short period on Harrison Road before the couple took over at the Queen's Head on Farm Street. Annie Lapidus was the sister of Billy Garrity, a prolific goalscorer for Aston Villa between 1897 and 1908, a period when the club were regarded as the best in England. In his youth, he had played for Highfield Villa, Lozells FC and Aston Shakespeare before signing for Villa. Billy Garrity won the Man of the Match award in the 1905 FA Cup final, in which Aston Villa beat Newcastle United 2-0. Surprisingly, he only played one game for England. This was against Wales in 1903. After a brief spell with Leicester Fosse, he signed for West Bromwich Albion in 1908, scoring 22 goals in 59 games. Once Billy Garrity's football days were over, I believe he worked for Ansell's on the drays before becoming a publican for the brewery. He was manager of the Ye Olde Green Man at Erdington. His sister Annie, along with Henry, lived above the pub for a while, and this is possibly where they decided that a life running a pub was for them. Henry and Annie were running the Queen's End on Farm Street by 1920. Within a few years, they moved the short distance to the Villa Tavern. Their stay in Villa Street was, however, brief, and by 1925 they had moved to the Aston Tavern on Aston Hall Road. They remained at the latter house for over a decade when Henry Lapidus died on Boxing Day in 1935. His younger brother Alfred died a few months later. He too had been a publican and had once been landlord of the Beggar's Bush Hotel at New Oscott. At the time of his death, he was running the Liverpool Arms Hotel at Beaumaris on Anglesey. Harry and Violet Cox were behind the servery in the mid-1920s. They later took on a shop in Freeth Street, but returned to the licensed trade to run the Dolphin Inn on Charles Henry Street. Henry Hawthorne moved to the Villa Tavern after a short spell running the Queen's Head on Burberry Street. The neighbouring manufactory saw a number of uses before the premises was occupied by Southall and Smith Limited. Founded in 1902, Southall and Smith had moved to Villa Street in order to meet demand by increasing production in larger premises. Manufacturing automatic weighing machines for commodities such as tea and flour, the firm moved into the former watch manufactory at the end of the Edwardian period. W&T Avery acquired a 50% stake in the business in 1920, finally taking over the company by 1928. It would seem that the Villa Street operation continued with a large degree of autonomy. The works grew in size in a somewhat piecemeal fashion. By the early 1930s, the Villa Tavern was operated by Atkinson's Brewery Limited. In 1933, the licensee was Edgar John Leeson. Born on New Year's Eve in 1901, his formative years were spent in Gooch Street, where his father worked as a jeweller and watchmaker. Both his mother and father had moved to Birmingham from Coventry. At the end of the 19th century, Edgar Sr. had opened the shop in Gooch Street. In the Edwardian period, however, the family moved to the High Street at Sturchley. Edgar was a schoolboy at this time, but his elder sisters all worked at the Cadbury chocolate factory in Bourneville. His father relocated the business to Smallbrook Street around the time of World War I. Edgar was still living above the shop with his parents in the mid-1920s. He was working as a watch repairer himself when he married Winifred Hampton at Holy Trinity Church at Birchfield in December 1932. The Villa Tavern was probably their first matrimonial home. After their spell running the Villa Tavern, they moved to Grange Road at Small Heath. However, it was not the end of their association with the licensed trade. By the start of the Second World War, the couple were stewards of the Ex-Servicemen's Memorial Institute on the Pershore Road at Cottridge. The house next door to the Villa Tavern was swept away when a new factory was constructed next to the pub. This was possibly to meet the requests by the Ministry of Supply to design and manufacture new types of special-purpose machines for the war effort. In later years, Avery's acquired George Driver and Son Limited, which resulted in merger with Southall and Smith Limited to form Driver Southall Limited. Production was eventually shifted to a facility at Tame Bridge near Walsall. On the website there is a lovely photograph of Catherine Willis outside the Villa Tavern. Her husband Joseph held the licence. The couple were married in July 1935. Her maiden name was Rook. In 1939 they were living in a court on Great Francis Street, from where Joseph was working as a steel polisher. However, Catherine was still pulling pints in a local pub, as she was recorded as a bar worker. Horace and Rose Smith followed Joseph and Catherine Willis as hosts of the Villa Tavern. Again, this was a couple that remained only for a short period. Just prior to the war, they were running a small emporium on Moat Lane, from where they sold drapery goods and groceries. The publican during the war years was Ernest Atkinson, who kept the tavern with his wife Winifred. The couple had married in August 1925. They had earlier run the White Hart on Sherlock Street. They were a couple who stuck at it for a while, running the Villa Tavern for over a decade. They were succeeded by Josiah and Evelyn Barnes in 1952. Ownership of the Villa Tavern was transferred when Atkinson's Brewery Limited were taken over by Mitchells and Butlers in 1959. The Villa Tavern was possibly deemed surplus to requirements, though this would be strange because the pub offered competition to the nearby Vine Inn, which was an Ansell's boozer. Whatever the reasoning, with former munitions worker Stanley Cope as the last licensee, the Villa Tavern closed for trading on February the 23rd, 1960.